The sentence was decided before Ethan Brooks ever entered the courtroom. Judge Harold Whitmore looked down from the bench as if he were not about to weigh a man's life, but merely stamp a document that had been waiting for his signature all morning. The courtroom was bright in the cruel way government buildings often are, washed in white light, polished wood, and the stale smell of old paper. Every cough sounded guilty. Every shuffle of shoes against the floor seemed too loud. Ethan stood beside the defense table in a dark suit borrowed from his church pastor, the sleeves half an inch too short, the collar pressing against his throat. His hands were still, but not relaxed. They rested at his sides like he had trained them not to tremble. Behind him, his mother, Lorraine Brooks, sat with a tissue folded so tightly in her fist that it had become a small white knot. Beside her, Ethan's younger sister Naomi stared at the floor, lips moving in silent prayer. Grace Miller, his court-appointed attorney, rose before the judge could speak. Your Honor, before sentencing, the defense renews its request to review the corrected timestamp evidence. The footage presented by the prosecution does not match the traffic camera logs from Bay Street, and the state has still not produced the original file. Judge Whitmore did not look at her. He lifted his glasses from the bridge of his nose, cleaned them once with a gray cloth, then set them back in place with slow, practiced patience. Ms. Miller, this court has heard your objections repeatedly. Grace kept her voice steady, but the folder in her hand bent slightly under her grip. Because they have not been answered, Your Honor. A murmur moved through the gallery like a draft under a closed door. The prosecutor, Alan Reeves, leaned back in his chair, one corner of his mouth lifting before he hid it behind his hand. Ethan noticed. Ethan noticed everything now. He noticed the deputy near the side door watching the clock instead of the judge. He noticed the man in the navy suit in the back row who had entered 15 minutes late and had not taken off his leather gloves. He noticed the red second hand above the seal of the court, sweeping toward 10:25. 5 minutes. That was what the voice on the phone had said the night before. Stay alive until 10:30. Do not react. Do not run. Let him speak first. Ethan had not slept after that call. He had sat at his kitchen table until dawn, staring at the chipped mug his mother had given him when he opened Brooks Auto Repair, the one that said Best Son in Savannah. 3 days earlier, he had found something hidden inside a customer's black Lincoln, tucked beneath the plastic cover near the passenger side kick panel. A small hard drive wrapped in electrical tape. He had almost thrown it into the lost and found bin, until the customer returned too fast, too nervous, asking questions no regular customer would ask. By nightfall, 2 detectives were at Ethan's shop. By midnight, his name was tied to a robbery he did not commit. By morning, the city had already decided what kind of man he was. Now Judge Whitmore leaned forward, both hands resting near the wooden gavel. Mr. Brooks, this court has considered the jury's verdict, the state's recommendation, and your refusal to accept responsibility. Ethan lifted his eyes. Not sharply, not with anger. Just enough to meet the man who seemed so certain he could bury the truth under procedure. Grace whispered, Ethan, don't say anything. He gave the smallest nod. He had promised her he would stay silent. He had promised the voice on the phone, too. Whitmore continued, his tone smooth enough to sound fair to anyone who had not been listening closely. You were entrusted with the benefit of due process. You received counsel. You received a trial by jury. And yet, at every stage, you have attempted to cast blame elsewhere instead of facing the harm your choices have caused. Lorraine made a sound behind him, half breath, half heartbreak. Ethan did not turn around. If he saw his mother's face, he knew something inside him might crack. Whitmore lifted the paper in front of him, though Ethan had the strange feeling the judge did not need to read it at all. The words had been waiting in his mouth from the start. For the charge of armed robbery, conspiracy, and obstruction, this court sentences you to 35 years in state custody. The gavel came down. The sound struck the room once, clean and final. Grace stood so quickly her chair scraped backward. Your Honor, we object to immediate remand pending federal review. Denied. There is active evidence tampering in this record. Whitmore's eyes finally moved to her, cold and narrow. Careful, Ms. Miller. Your career is still young enough to survive one bad client. The room went quiet in a different way then. Not legal quiet. Human quiet. Ethan felt the deputies step closer. He felt the air change around his wrists as one of them prepared to secure the cuffs. He looked past the judge, past the flag, past the carved seal of justice mounted high on the wall, and found the clock again. 10:29. Judge Whitmore gathered his papers with a satisfied calm, as if the world had obeyed him exactly as expected. Then Ethan spoke for the first time since the hearing began, his voice low, even, and clear enough to make every head turn. "You know I didn't do this, Your Honor." Whitmore paused with one hand on the file. For half a second, something flickered behind his eyes. Not guilt. Recognition. Then it vanished. "Remove him," the judge said. The deputy touched Ethan's arm. Lorraine stood behind him, crying now without sound. Grace looked toward the rear entrance, desperate, searching, as if hope might arrive wearing a badge. The red second hand climbed. 1 tick. 2. 3. At exactly 10:30, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom opened. The doors did not slam. They opened with a controlled weight that made the silence feel even sharper. For people stepped into the courtroom in dark federal jackets, their shoes quiet against the polished floor, their faces unreadable beneath the pale overhead lights. At the center was a man in his early 40s with close-cropped brown hair and a square jaw, carrying a folded document in one hand. He did not rush. He did not need to. The room made space for him before he asked for it. Ethan saw the gold seal first, then the words across the front of the jackets, and for one brief second the courtroom faded away. The cuffs had not yet closed around his wrists, the judge had not yet recovered his expression, and his mother's silent crying seemed to drift somewhere far behind him. All Ethan could hear was the ticking clock, and beneath it, the memory of a different sound, the soft bell above the door of Brooks Auto Repair on a humid Tuesday afternoon. That was where all of this had started, not in a courtroom, not under a judge's stare, but in a narrow garage on the east side of Savannah, where the air always smelled of motor oil, black coffee, and hot rubber after a long day. Ethan had opened the shop 7 years earlier with 2 tool chests, a used hydraulic lift, and a loan he still paid every month with the stubborn faith of a man who believed honest work should be enough. His father had taught him engines before he taught him how to shave. "Listen first," his father used to say, "because every machine tells you what hurts before it fails." Ethan had built his life around that sentence. He listened to engines. He listened to neighbors. He listened to elderly customers who came in for an oil change and stayed to talk about the weather, their grandchildren, and the price of groceries. He was not the kind of man people noticed in headlines. He was the kind of man people called when their car would not start and they had to get to work by 8. Every morning, he unlocked the rolling metal door at 6:30, swept the concrete, brewed a pot of coffee strong enough to wake the street, and taped new bills to the side of the office cabinet so he would not forget what responsibility looked like. His mother's prescriptions, Naomi's community college books, the electric bill, the shop insurance, the parts invoice from Macon. Nothing dramatic, nothing heroic, just life, stacked one paper at a time. That Tuesday, the black Lincoln arrived without an appointment. Ethan remembered the driver because the man never took off his sunglasses, even inside the garage. He said the dashboard had started flickering and the passenger window would not roll down. Simple work, maybe 2 hours, maybe less. The registration listed a shell company out of Atlanta, but Ethan did not think much of it. Expensive cars often arrived with complicated paperwork and owners who did not like waiting. He pulled the Lincoln into Bay 2, connected the diagnostic scanner, and found a wiring fault near the passenger side panel. When he removed the plastic cover, a small object dropped into his palm. A portable hard drive, wrapped neatly in black electrical tape. For a moment, Ethan only stared at it. People left strange things in cars all the time. Wedding rings, parking tickets, children's toys. Once, an envelope with $1,200 inside that he returned before the customer had even noticed it was missing. So Ethan did what he always did. He placed the hard drive in a clear bag, wrote the work order number on it, and locked it in the office drawer. 10 minutes later, the driver came back. Not at closing, not after a phone call, but suddenly, fast enough to make the bell over the door hit the glass twice. His smile was polite, but his eyes searched the office like a flashlight. He asked if Ethan had found anything unusual. Ethan said he had found a loose ground wire and an aftermarket device near the panel. The man's jaw tightened. He asked for it back. Ethan told him anything removed from a vehicle had to be logged and returned with the invoice. That was shop policy. Simple, boring, safe. The man left without raising his voice, but the air behind him felt colder than the air before. By sunset, 2 city detectives stood beneath the shop lights asking where Ethan had been the previous Friday night. By 9 o'clock, his tools were still scattered across the floor while they searched his office. By midnight, a report said his vehicle had been seen near a robbery scene on River Street. By breakfast, people who had known him for years looked at him like a stranger on the news. In court, weeks later, the evidence came wrapped in official language. A partial plate, a grainy image, a witness who would not meet his eyes, a prosecutor who spoke with clean confidence. Judge Whitmore moved every objection aside like dust. But Ethan had already made one decision they did not know about. Before the detectives came, before the accusations hardened, before fear tried to teach him silence, he had copied the serial number from that hard drive and called the one federal number his pastor's cousin had given him years ago after a neighborhood fraud case. Now, in the courtroom, the man with the folded document stopped at the center aisle. Judge Whitmore's hand remained frozen above his papers. The agent looked first at Ethan, then at the bench. "I am Special Agent Daniel Mercer," he said, his voice calm enough to make everyone else sound guilty. "No one leaves this courtroom." Special Agent Daniel Mercer's words did not echo, but they settled over the courtroom with the weight of a locked door. "No one leaves this courtroom." The deputy beside Ethan lowered his hands, suddenly unsure whether the cuffs still belonged in this moment. Grace Miller stood frozen with one palm on the defense table, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and recognition. Judge Whitmore did not move at first. He remained seated above them all, framed by the flag, the seal, and the polished bench that had made his voice sound larger than any other voice in that room for nearly 20 years. Then he smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the kind of careful expression powerful men use when they believe the world has made a small procedural mistake that can be corrected with a phone call. "Agent Mercer," he said, folding his hands on the desk, "this is an active state proceeding. You are interrupting a lawful sentencing." Mercer looked at him without blinking. "The sentencing is part of the reason we are here." A ripple moved through the gallery. Alan Reeves, the prosecutor, sat forward so quickly his pen rolled off the table and tapped once against the floor. The man in the navy suit at the back row shifted in his seat, leather gloves tightening around the edge of a briefcase. Ethan saw it. Mercer saw it too. One of the federal agents moved quietly toward the rear doors, not threatening, not hurried, only present enough to make the man stop moving. Judge Whitmore's smile thinned. "If your office has concerns, you may file through proper channels." Mercer unfolded the document in his hand. "We did." The paper made a soft sound as it opened, small and dry, like a page turning in a room where everyone had forgotten how to breathe. "This is a federal warrant signed at 8:46 this morning." Whitmore's face remained composed, but his right thumb pressed once against the edge of his sleeve. Ethan remembered that gesture. He had seen it twice during trial, both times when Grace came too close to something the judge wanted buried. Whitmore looked toward the clerk. "This record will reflect that federal officers entered during state sentencing without prior notice." Mercer's gaze did not leave him. "The record will reflect a great deal more than that, Your Honor." The words "Your Honor" landed differently now, not as respect, but as evidence waiting to be labeled. For the first time, Ethan noticed the people who had always seemed invisible around the courtroom. The clerk staring down at her keyboard, pale and rigid. The bailiff looking from the judge to the agents like a man watching a bridge crack beneath his feet. The court reporter's fingers hovering over the keys, afraid to miss a word. And behind all of them, in the second row, Lorraine Brooks covered her mouth with both hands, not to hide grief this time, but to hold back a hope so fragile it seemed dangerous to touch. Whitmore leaned back. "What exactly are you alleging?" Mercer stepped closer to the bench, stopping below it, refusing to look upward as though the height of the platform meant nothing. "Evidence tampering, wire fraud, conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation, judicial corruption connected to cases involving Kane Infrastructure Group and its subsidiaries." The name changed the temperature of the room. Victor Kane had been a shadow throughout Ethan's trial, never named in front of the jury, never called as a witness, never forced to answer why a car tied to one of his companies had passed through Ethan's repair shop days before the arrest. But everyone in Savannah knew Kane's name. His company repaired bridges, paved highways, built county offices, donated to campaigns, sponsored youth baseball uniforms, and appeared beside judges and mayors in ribbon-cutting photographs. He was the kind of man whose money entered rooms before he did. Whitmore's jaw tightened. "You are making dangerous accusations in open court." "No," Mercer said. "I am executing a warrant in open court." Ethan watched the judge's eyes flick toward Alan Reeves. Just once. It was quick, almost nothing, but Grace saw it too. She slowly turned her head toward the prosecutor, and the anger in her face was quiet enough to be frightening. Reeves reached for his briefcase, then stopped when another federal agent stepped beside his table. "Hands where I can see them, please," the agent said, his voice calm, almost gentle. The prosecutor lifted both palms and swallowed. No shouting, no chaos, just the clean, devastating sound of authority changing sides. Mercer placed a second document on the edge of the bench. "Judge Harold Whitmore, you are named in a sealed federal indictment returned yesterday evening." The judge stood then, not fast, but with the offended dignity of a man still trying to perform innocence for an audience. His black robe fell around him like a curtain. "This is absurd." Mercer reached into his folder and removed a photograph, then another, then a printed transcript. He set them down one by one. Payments routed through the Whitmore Family Trust. Case assignments altered through the clerk's office. Suppressed video metadata from Bay Street. Communications with Victor Kane's legal counsel on the morning Mr. Brooks was arrested. Ethan's throat tightened at the sound of his name. For weeks, the room had spoken about him like a problem to be solved, a file to be closed, a body to be moved from one place to another. Now his name sounded different. Not cleared yet, not safe yet, but no longer alone. Whitmore looked down at the documents, and for the first time, the color drained from his face in a way no robe, no title, and no polished bench could hide. Mercer lowered his voice. "You sentenced an innocent man to protect a corrupt deal. Now step down from the bench." Judge Whitmore did not step down. For a few seconds, he stood behind the bench with both hands resting on the polished wood, his robe hanging from his shoulders like a piece of authority he was trying to keep from slipping. The courtroom waited for the old rhythm to return, for the judge to clear his throat, strike the gavel, and make everyone remember who controlled the room. But the rhythm had broken. Special Agent Daniel Mercer remained below the bench, still as stone, while the federal agents held their positions by the doors, the aisles, and the prosecution table. No one raised a voice. No one needed to. Whitmore looked at Grace Miller as if she were the source of the stains spreading across his morning. "This is what happens when inexperienced counsel confuses losing with conspiracy," he said. Grace's face did not change, but Ethan saw her fingers tighten on the edge of the defense table. She had been spoken to like that for 6 weeks. Too young, too emotional, too ambitious, too naive to understand how the courthouse worked. Every time she had filed a motion, it had returned denied in language so neat it felt pre-written. Every time she asked for the original footage, the prosecution sent another compressed copy with missing metadata. Every time she mentioned the black Lincoln, someone redirected the room back to Ethan's old pickup truck and a witness who had changed his story after meeting privately with Alan Reeves. She had not slept much since taking Ethan's case. Her small office above a bail bond company smelled of coffee, printer ink, and rain leaking through a window frame she could not afford to fix. At midnight, she read traffic logs. At 2 in the morning, she called retired officers who told her to stop digging before she ruined her career. At 4, she sat under the yellow desk lamp with Ethan's file spread around her and circled the same impossibility again and again. Ethan could not have been on River Street at 9:12 when the repair shop camera showed him locking the front bay door at 9:10, 7 miles away, in work boots, carrying a box of brake pads. The numbers did not bend. Only people did. Now, in the courtroom, Grace slowly stood straighter. "Your Honor, with respect, I did not confuse anything." Whitmore turned toward her, grateful for a familiar target. "Sit down, Ms. Miller." No, the word was quiet, but it changed the air around her. The clerk looked up. Lorraine Brooks lowered her hands from her mouth. Ethan turned his head, just slightly, afraid that if he moved too much the moment might shatter. Grace lifted the folder she had been holding since sentencing began. The paper inside was worn at the corners, marked with blue ink, red tabs, and the kind of desperation only an honest person brings into a room built to ignore her. I submitted 3 requests for the original surveillance file. I was denied. I submitted 2 motions regarding the chain of custody. Denied. I requested a hearing on the corrected timestamp from the Bay Street traffic camera. Denied before the state even responded. Alan Reeves shifted in his chair. This is not the time for argument. Grace looked at him then, and all the fear he had mistaken for weakness was gone. You had the original file, Mr. Reeves. I know because your office referenced metadata that was not present in the version given to the defense. Reeves opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Mercer glanced to the agent beside him, who made a note without looking up. Whitmore's voice hardened. Ms. Miller, you are dangerously close to contempt. Grace gave a small, sad smile. I think we passed contempt when this court sentenced my client before reviewing evidence that could clear him. The words landed cleanly, not dramatic, not polished, simply true. Ethan looked at her and remembered their first meeting through scratched glass in the county jail. She had carried a canvas bag too heavy for one shoulder, apologized for being late, then spent 2 hours listening while he explained the Lincoln, the hard drive, the driver with sunglasses, the detectives who arrived too fast. She had not promised she could save him. She had only said, I believe records more than rumors. Let us find the records. That sentence had kept him standing through the trial. Whitmore reached for the gavel, perhaps out of habit, perhaps because his hand needed something that still felt like power. But before he could touch it, Mercer spoke. Judge Whitmore, remove your hand from the bench and step down. The judge stared at him. You are making a mistake that will end your career. Mercer's expression did not move. My career is not on trial today. For the first time, the courtroom saw Harold Whitmore without the shield of procedure. His title remained. His robe remained. The seal still hung above him, but something essential had gone thin. He looked toward the side door judges used to enter and leave unseen. A federal agent was already standing there. He looked toward Alan Reeves. Reeves looked down. He looked toward the gallery, where reporters had begun lifting their phones with trembling restraint. No rescue came. Ethan felt the deputy step away from him. Just one step, but it felt like a mile of air. Grace looked at Ethan, and though neither of them smiled, something passed between them. Not victory. Not yet. Recognition. The truth had entered the room, and this time, it had brought witnesses. The truth had entered the room, but Judge Whitmore still tried to make it kneel. He drew himself upright behind the bench, lifted his chin, and looked past Special Agent Daniel Mercer as if the federal badge were only another interruption in a long morning of inconveniences. This court will not be turned into theater, he said. His voice was controlled, but thinner now, stretched too tight over the fear beneath it. If there are allegations against me, they will be handled through the proper judicial review board, not by staging a spectacle in front of defendants, reporters, and emotional family members. The words emotional family members made Lorraine Brooks close her eyes. Ethan felt it more than saw it. His mother had worked 31 years as a cafeteria manager at an elementary school, waking before sunrise, packing lunches for children who forgot theirs, buying coats for students whose sleeves stopped above their wrists. She had taught Ethan to iron his church shirts, return extra change, and never mistake quiet for weakness. Now a man who had just tried to take 35 years from her son reduced her pain to an inconvenience. Ethan's hands curled once, then opened. He would not give Whitmore the reaction he wanted. Mercer stepped closer, his document held low at his side. This is not theater. This is the record correcting itself. Whitmore gave a short laugh without warmth. The record? The record shows a conviction. Grace Miller answered before Mercer could. The record shows misconduct. Alan Reeves turned sharply toward her. You should be careful, Grace. She looked at him with a steadiness that seemed to surprise even herself. I was careful. That was the problem. I followed every rule while you broke them quietly. The prosecutor's face changed, not into guilt exactly, but into the frightened calculation of a man searching for the safest person to betray. He looked at Whitmore, then at Mercer, then down at the briefcase beside his chair. I relied on what was given to me, he said. The sentence fell into the room like a glass set gently on a table, ordinary and devastating. Whitmore's head turned toward him. Mr. Reeves. Reeves swallowed. The state received the surveillance package from County Technical Services. Grace opened her folder. No, it did not. County Technical Services sent the original package to your office with embedded timestamps and location metadata. What the defense received was a converted copy created 18 hours later. Mercer nodded once to the agent standing beside the prosecution table. The agent placed a sealed evidence sleeve on the table. Inside it, a small portable drive marked with a white federal label. Ethan recognized its shape before he recognized the label. His breath caught. The hard drive from the Lincoln. The thing that had sat in his office drawer for less than an hour and still managed to pull his whole life into a storm. Mercer looked toward the gallery. For the benefit of the court record, this device was recovered through a voluntary disclosure made by Mr. Brooks prior to his arrest. Its contents include financial ledgers, recorded meetings, and communications linking multiple county contracts to unlawful payments. Whitmore's hand tightened around the edge of the bench. That is impossible. No, Mercer said. It was inconvenient. A sound moved through the courtroom, not quite a gasp, not quite a whisper. Reporters stopped pretending not to record. The court reporter's fingers moved quickly now, capturing each word as though the machine itself had awakened. Grace turned slowly toward Ethan. For the first time since the federal agents walked in, she understood. Not all of it, but enough. He had not failed to tell her because he distrusted her. He had stayed silent because someone had asked him to survive long enough for the trap to close. Ethan wanted to explain, to apologize for letting her fight blind through weeks of humiliation, but this was not the moment. His eyes only said what his mouth could not. Grace gave the smallest nod. Whitmore pointed toward Ethan, and the old cruelty returned, rawer now because it had lost its polish. You expect this room to believe that a mechanic from the East Side stumbled upon a federal corruption file by accident. Ethan finally looked directly at him. The courtroom light reflected in his eyes, steady and unblinking. No, sir, he said. I expect them to believe you thought I was too small to matter. The words did not come loudly. That was why they struck so hard. Lorraine opened her eyes. Naomi covered her mouth. Even the deputy beside Ethan looked down, ashamed of how close his hands had come to the cuffs. Whitmore's face tightened, and for a second, Ethan saw the man behind the robe, not powerful, not untouchable, just cornered by the same truth he had spent years teaching others to fear. Mercer lifted another page. We also have testimony from a cooperating witness. The rear door opened again, and the man in the Navy suit with leather gloves stood under the watch of a federal agent. His face had gone gray under the fluorescent lights. Alan Reeves whispered something no one could hear. Whitmore did not whisper. He stared as if the floor had disappeared beneath him. Mercer spoke with the patience of a man placing the final stone on a grave of lies. Your driver has been speaking with us since last night. The man in the Navy suit lowered his eyes. The room understood before anyone explained. The Lincoln, the missing file, the staged evidence, the private calls, the sentence, all of it had been built like a locked door, and Ethan Brooks had become the man they tried to bury behind it. But now every hinge was visible. Every key had a name, and the judge who had promised him 35 years could no longer command 5 more. Minutes of silence. For a moment after Mercer named the driver, the courtroom did not feel like a place built for law. It felt like a room underwater. Every person seemed to move slower, breathe quieter, think louder. The fluorescent lights hummed above the ceiling panels. A printer clicked somewhere behind the clerk's station. Outside the tall windows, traffic rolled past the courthouse in ordinary morning rhythm, tires hissing over damp pavement, a delivery truck backing up 2 blocks away, life continuing as if a man had not nearly lost 35 years in the space of one sentence. Ethan Brooks stood very still. He had imagined this moment in 100 different ways during the sleepless nights in county holding. He had imagined anger, relief, maybe even triumph. But what came over him first was exhaustion, deep and quiet, settling into his shoulders like the weight of wet clothes. The deputy who had been ready to cuff him stepped back another inch, then another, as if shame had a physical distance. Ethan looked down at his own hands. They were the same hands that had rebuilt transmissions, held his mother's grocery bags, signed Naomi's tuition forms, and cleaned oil from beneath his fingernails every night with orange soap and a stiff brush. For 6 weeks, those hands had been photographed, printed, discussed, and treated like evidence of a life people had already judged. Now they simply hung at his sides, open and empty. Lorraine rose from the second row, not fully, just halfway, one hand on the wooden rail in front of her. Her face was wet, but she did not make a sound. Ethan wanted to go to her. He wanted to cross the few feet between them and put his arms around the woman who had stood outside the jail every visiting day wearing her Sunday coat, pretending she was not cold, pretending she was not afraid. But Mercer had said no one leaves, and Ethan understood that this was still a federal operation, still a room full of unfinished danger wrapped in official calm. So he stayed where he was, and his mother stayed where she was, and the distance between them became one more thing the truth had to cross. Grace Miller lowered herself slowly into her chair. The folder slipped from her hands onto the table, spreading papers across the wood like fallen leaves. She stared at Ethan, then at the evidence sleeve, then at Mercer. Her face carried too many emotions for one expression to hold. Hurt because he had not told her. Relief because he had lived long enough for the truth to arrive. Anger because the system had made secrecy safer than trust. Ethan met her eyes and whispered, "I am sorry." Grace heard him. She did not answer with words. She only pressed her lips together and nodded once, the way a person nods when forgiveness will come later, after breathing becomes easier. Judge Whitmore remained behind the bench, but the bench no longer protected him from being seen. His robe looked heavier now. His glasses sat crooked on his face. One of the federal agents had moved beside the clerk's station, speaking softly to the court clerk, who was unlocking a side drawer with trembling fingers. Another agent collected Alan Reeves's phone, tablet, and briefcase, placing each item into separate evidence bags with careful labels. The sound of plastic sealing shut became strangely loud. Whitmore looked toward the gallery again, searching for loyalty in faces that had spent years fearing him. He found none. The reporters watched him with open hunger. The bailiff watched the floor. The clerk avoided his eyes. Even the prosecutor, who had laughed at Grace's objections an hour earlier, now sat pale and silent, hands flat on the table like a schoolboy waiting outside the principal's office. Mercer stepped back from the bench and turned toward Ethan. His voice softened, not enough to break procedure, only enough to become human. "Mr. Brooks, you did exactly what we asked you to do." Ethan swallowed. The words should have comforted him, but they opened something tender instead. Because doing exactly what they asked had meant sitting through testimony that made neighbors doubt him. It had meant watching his mother walk past cameras with her head down. It had meant letting Judge Whitmore pronounce years over his life, while every instinct in him wanted to shout the truth. He looked at Mercer and said, "I almost did not." Mercer's eyes held his. Most people would not have. The room fell quiet around that answer. Ethan thought of the phone call, the federal voice telling him the hard drive was part of something larger than his case, larger than one crooked sentence, larger than one frightened mechanic trying to clear his name. He had agreed because he believed truth mattered. He had not understood that truth could be so cold while it waited. He turned toward the clock above the seal. The red second hand kept moving, indifferent and precise. 10:32. 2 minutes past the end of his old life. Maybe 2 minutes into the beginning of another. At 10:33, the side door near the judge's hallway opened, and a woman in a charcoal suit stepped into the courtroom carrying a laptop against her chest. She was older than Grace by maybe 20 years, with silver at her temples and the tired, focused eyes of someone who had spent too long reading lies in small print. Mercer turned toward her. "Agent Price." She nodded and placed the laptop on the clerk's counter. "The live feed from the courthouse garage is secured. Victor Kane has been detained outside the building with 2 phones, a county access badge, and a folder containing a prepared statement for Judge Whitmore's resignation." The name struck the room harder the second time. Ethan saw Judge Whitmore close his eyes for one brief second, as if the sound itself had stepped on a nerve. Alan Reeves whispered, "Oh, God," and then seemed ashamed that he had spoken at all. Mercer did not look surprised. Was he alone? "No," Agent Price said. His attorney was with him. They were attempting to leave before sentencing concluded. Grace slowly stood again. "Before sentencing concluded?" Agent Price looked at her. Their statement was time-stamped 10:28. The courtroom absorbed that detail piece by piece. 10:28. Before the federal doors opened. Before Mercer spoke. Before anyone in the gallery knew the sentence would be interrupted. Ethan turned toward the bench, and this time his gaze did not ask for mercy, truth, or even recognition. It simply held Judge Whitmore in the light of what everyone had heard. Whitmore's lips parted, but no explanation came. The black robe no longer made him look like justice. It made him look like a man standing in borrowed darkness. Mercer opened another folder and removed several printed pages clipped together at the top. The federal investigation began 11 months ago, he said, his voice clear enough for the court reporter, the gallery, and every recording device in the room. Kane Infrastructure Group received multiple county contracts after sealed bids were altered. When internal accountants raised concerns, civil cases involving those contracts were steered to this courtroom. Evidence disappeared. Deadlines shifted. Witnesses changed their statements after private meetings. And people who asked too many questions suddenly faced charges that made them look unreliable. Ethan felt those last words move through him slowly. People who asked too many questions. Not just him. For the first time, he understood that his suffering had not been an exception. It had been a pattern. He was one name on a long list hidden behind legal language and stamped orders. Mercer continued. Mr. Brooks became relevant to the investigation when a Kane vehicle was serviced at his repair shop. The driver mistakenly left behind a storage device containing backup ledgers and recorded conversations. Mr. Brooks did not open the device. He secured it, documented it, and made contact with federal authorities after the driver returned under suspicious circumstances. Grace looked at Ethan again, and the hurt in her face softened into something more complicated. Respect, maybe. Grief, too, for the fact that doing the right thing had cost him so much before anyone called it courage. Mercer turned slightly, so the room could see Ethan clearly. After that contact, Mr. Brooks agreed to cooperate. For his safety and to protect the scope of the investigation, only a limited federal team knew his role. Lorraine made a small sound then. Not a cry, not a question. Only the sound of a mother realizing her son had walked through danger without letting her carry any of it. Ethan finally turned to her. "I am sorry, Mama," he said quietly. Her face crumpled, but she nodded as if she understood even before she forgave the secrecy. Judge Whitmore found his voice. "You used this man as bait." Mercer's eyes moved back to him. "No, you did. We gave him a choice. You gave him 35 years. The courtroom went still again, but this stillness had heat inside it. The kind that comes when people understand the moral shape of what they have witnessed. The deputy nearest Ethan looked at Mercer and asked, "Should the restraints be removed?" Mercer nodded. "Mr. Brooks is not in custody." The words reached Ethan before the key did. Not in custody. The deputy stepped in carefully, almost reverently now, and unlocked the cuffs that had been waiting for Ethan's wrists since the gavel fell. Metal clicked open. Such a small sound. So ordinary. Yet Lorraine pressed both hands to her chest as if it had reached across the room and loosened something around her own heart. Grace wiped quickly beneath one eye and looked away, trying to keep the dignity of counsel when all she wanted was the relief of a human being. Mercer stepped toward the bench once more. "Harold Whitmore, you are under arrest pursuant to a federal warrant." The judge stared down at him. "I have served this county for 19 years. Mercer answered softly, almost sadly. "That is what makes this worse." No one clapped. No one shouted. The silence was heavier than applause could ever be. Whitmore slowly came around from behind the bench, each step measured, each inch away from the seat of power, stripping another layer from the image he had built over decades. When he reached the courtroom floor, he was no longer above Ethan. He was simply across from him, eye level, breathing the same air. Ethan looked at him once, not with hatred, but with the calm of a man refusing to become what had tried to break him. Whitmore looked away first. Whitmore was escorted toward the side aisle without the courtroom giving him the dignity of noise. No one rose for him now. No one lowered their eyes because his robe passed near them. The same people who had once measured their words around him watched in stunned silence as federal agents guided him past the prosecution table, past the jury box, past the wooden rail where ordinary citizens had stood for years waiting to learn what he would take from them. His shoes made a soft, careful sound on the floor. That was what stayed with Ethan, not the warrant, not the cameras, not even the look on Whitmore's face. The sound of expensive shoes leaving a courtroom that no longer belonged to him. When the side door closed, the room breathed for the first time. Not all at once. A small breath from the clerk. A shaky one from Grace. A broken one from Lorraine. Ethan stood where the deputy had left him, feeling the absence of the cuffs like warmth after a long winter. His wrists were untouched, yet he rubbed them anyway, not because they hurt, but because his body remembered what his future had almost become. Mercer spoke quietly to another agent, then turned back. "Mr. Brooks, the state proceedings are suspended pending review. The United States Attorney's Office and the State Attorney General have both been notified. You are free to remain with your family while formal motions are filed." Free. The word did not land the way Ethan thought it would. It did not burst open. It did not lift him off the floor. It entered slowly, cautiously, like someone stepping into a house after a storm to see what still stood. Lorraine did not wait for permission this time. She came through the rail gate with Naomi beside her, moving fast and then slower as she neared him, as if afraid he might disappear if she reached too quickly. Ethan turned just as his mother touched his face with both hands. She looked at him the way she had when he was 8 years old and came home from school with a fever he tried to hide because he did not want her to miss work. "My boy," she whispered. That was all. No speech. No prayer loud enough for strangers. Just 2 words that carried every morning she had gotten up before sunrise, every bill she had paid late, every jail visit she had survived without letting him see her break. Ethan folded his arms around her, and for the first time since his arrest, he allowed his shoulders to fall. Naomi pressed against them both, crying openly now. The courtroom watched, but Ethan barely noticed. The world had narrowed to his mother's coat smelling faintly of lavender detergent and cafeteria rolls, Naomi's fingers gripping the back of his suit, and the hard wooden floor beneath his shoes reminding him he was still standing. Grace remained at the defense table, gathering papers she no longer seemed to see. Ethan released his family gently and walked to her. She looked up, and the apology in his eyes arrived before his words. "I should have told you more." Grace shook her head once. "You were trying to stay alive inside a system that was already lying about you." Her voice almost held, then cracked at the edge. "I thought I had failed you." Ethan looked down at the files, the motions, the denied requests, the ink marks that proved she had fought even when the room punished her for it. "You were the only person in here who treated me like the truth mattered before it was useful." Grace pressed one hand over her mouth and looked away, but not before he saw tears brighten her eyes. Across the room, Alan Reeves stood slowly as an agent finished labeling his briefcase. He looked smaller without the confidence of the state wrapped around his shoulders. "Mr. Brooks," he said, his voice barely above the hum of the lights. Lorraine stiffened, but Ethan lifted one hand softly, asking her to let him answer. Reeves swallowed. "I do not know what I was told and what I chose not to question. That is not an excuse." Ethan studied him for a long moment. He thought of the prosecutor's clean voice turning suspicion into certainty, of the jury watching Reeves point at a screen, of Grace being dismissed while Reeves sat comfortably beside files he should have examined harder. Anger rose in Ethan, but it did not ask to be spoken loudly. "Then question it now," Ethan said. "Every case, every file, every person who did not have a hard drive to save them." Reeves lowered his head. No forgiveness was offered. None was demanded. Only responsibility, placed between them like evidence no one could seal away. Mercer approached with Agent Price at his side. "There will be more interviews, Mr. Brooks. But not today unless you choose otherwise." Ethan looked toward the windows, where late morning light had begun to soften the hard white glare of the courtroom. Outside, the courthouse steps would be filling with cameras. People would want his face, his pain, his story turned into something easy to repeat. But inside, for one more moment, he belonged only to himself and the people who had waited for him. He nodded toward Mercer. "Today I want to take my mother home." Mercer's expression softened. "That can be arranged." Ethan turned back to the bench. The gavel was still there, resting near the abandoned sentencing papers. For weeks, that small wooden object had sounded like an ending. Now it looked strangely powerless, just wood under light, no stronger than the hand that used it. Ethan stepped toward it, not touching it yet, only looking. Grace came beside him. Lorraine stood on his other side. The courtroom remained silent, and in that silence Ethan understood something he had not been able to feel while fear was still pressing against his chest. Justice was not the sound of a powerful man falling. It was the sound of an innocent man being called back by his name. Ethan did not touch the gavel right away. He stood before the bench with Grace on one side and his mother on the other, looking at the small piece of polished wood as if it were a thing that had finally lost its voice. Around him, the courtroom continued in careful motion. Federal agents sealed evidence bags. The clerk whispered into a phone with one hand pressed against her chest, and reporters near the back typed so quickly their screens flashed like distant lightning. Yet the center of the room felt still. The chair behind the bench was empty. The sentencing papers lay abandoned, one corner lifted slightly by the air conditioning, trembling as if the paper itself understood it no longer had power over him. Ethan reached out, not to claim the gavel, not to celebrate, but to straighten it. He placed it gently in the center of the bench and looked at the seal above it. "Let it serve the truth now," he said. His voice was quiet, but everyone close enough heard it. Grace closed her eyes for 1 second. Lorraine slipped her hand into his, and her fingers were warm despite the cold. Courtroom air. Outside the doors, the courthouse had already become another world. Cameras crowded the marble steps. Microphones rose toward him the moment he appeared, and questions came from every direction, overlapping, hungry, confused. "Ethan Brooks, how does it feel? Did you know the Federal Bureau of Investigation was coming? What do you want to say to the judge? Are you planning to sue the county?" Ethan stopped at the top step beneath the heavy stone columns, blinking in the late morning sun. Savannah looked the same and not the same. Traffic moved along the street. A woman pushed a stroller past the courthouse lawn. A flag snapped softly above the entrance. 6 weeks ago, those ordinary things had belonged to other people. Now the air touched his face like something returned. Mercer stood a few feet away, giving him room. Grace remained just behind his shoulder, no longer only his lawyer, but the witness to everything the room had tried to erase. Ethan looked at the microphones, then at the crowd, then at his mother. Lorraine nodded once, not telling him what to say, only reminding him who he was before all of this. Ethan stepped forward. "I want to go home," he said. The reporters quieted, disappointed by the simplicity of it. But Ethan continued. "And I want every case connected to that courtroom reviewed. Not just mine. Everybody who did not have cameras waiting. Everybody who did not have a lawyer who stayed up all night. Everybody whose mother sat in a gallery and was told her pain was an interruption." No one shouted after that. Even the cameras seemed to hold still. He did not raise his voice. He did not point toward the courthouse. He did not say he hated anyone. He only stood there in the sunlight with his borrowed suit, his tired eyes, and his mother's hand in his, saying the kind of truth that does not need decoration. Then Mercer guided them through a side path away from the crowd, where a plain federal sedan waited by the curb. Ethan paused before getting in and looked back at the courthouse. The same building, the same stone, the same windows. But something had changed in the way the light struck it. Not enough to make the world clean. Enough to prove dirt could be seen. That afternoon, Brooks Auto Repair remained closed, but someone had taped a handwritten sign to the rolling door. "Welcome home, Ethan." Beneath it were flowers, envelopes, a paper cup of coffee from the diner across the street, and a small toy car left by a boy whose mother used to bring her minivan in for brake service. Ethan stood on the sidewalk for a long time, one hand resting against the cool metal door. He could smell rain in the distance and motor oil from somewhere deep inside the shop. Naomi unlocked the side entrance. Lorraine went in first and turned on the office light. It flickered once, then steadied. Ethan followed slowly. Nothing inside had moved. His father's old wrench still hung on the wall. The chipped mug still sat beside the coffee maker. The bills were still taped to the cabinet. Life had waited, wounded but present. Grace arrived near sunset with a box of case files under one arm and 2 coffees in a cardboard tray. She did not knock. Ethan looked up from his desk, and for the first time that day, he almost smiled. "More work?" he asked. Grace set the box down. "A lot more." Lorraine placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Outside, the sky softened from gold to blue over the quiet street. No courtroom, no gavel, no sentence hanging over his breath. Just the low hum of the shop lights, the smell of coffee, and the sound of pages opening one by one. Ethan sat beside Grace, pulled the first file closer, and began to read. The night settled gently over Savannah, and for once, the silence did not feel like fear. It felt like justice learning to speak carefully through every name that had been waiting to be heard.